Hi guys, welcome. This week we're going to be talking about, did you hear me? That's right, I said this week we're going to be talking about listening. Now, in terms of frequency, listening ranks first among communication activities. Well, in order to begin our journey and explore the importance of listening, I want to start with two really integral activities. So first, I want you to close your eyes and I want you to listen to the list of words that I'm going to read to you. Now, don't write them down. This is on the honor system, but just try to remember as many as you can. Okay, let's begin. The first is dream, sleep, night, mattress, snooze, sheet, nod, tired, night, artichoke, insomnia, blanket, night, alarm, nap, snore, and pillow. Now, later on in our journey, I'm going to ask you to recall as many as you can. Remember, no cheating. This is on the honor system. I mean, if you have to cheat, come on now. So no cheating. Try to remember as many as you can. And no, don't go back and replay the list. Just try to go off your active memory. All right, next slide. Now, our next activity involves closing your eyes and simply listening for sound. I'm not going to talk. I'm not going to say anything, and I'm not going to use language. We're right now just listening for sound. So I'm going to play a series of sounds. Each sound is going to play twice. Close your eyes and try to identify the sound. Here we go. Okay, that was the next sound, but we're gonna stop at number 6. So, how many sounds do you guys think you were able to identify? Open your eyes and let's go over the sounds. Number 1, the first was bowling pins. That was the sound that you heard. It was someone bowling at a bowling alley and the ball going down the alley and crashing into the pins. Number 2 was a toilet flushing. Did you guys get that one? That one was pretty easy. Number 2 was a toilet flushing. Number 3 was a pretty weird sound. That was an owl howling. That was an owl howling. Number 4 was a pin clicking. It was a pin clicking. It was a pin clicking. Number 5 was a plate smashing. That's a pretty identifiable sound. So that one was pretty easy. And number 6 was a vacuum. That's right, a vacuum cleaner. So how many were you able to identify? Most people are able to get at least, 4. And if you're a really great listener, up there to the 5s and 6s. So that was a fun activity. Let's move on. Okay, next question. I want you guys to take a look at this symbol. And can anybody guess what this symbol is? Huh? Oh, no, nope, that's not correct. Nope, that's not right either. No, that's not it either. I'm just kidding, guys. I can't hear you because I'm online, but I can hear you like guessing in my mind. So anyway, let's go to the next slide and see what this is. This Chinese character makes up the verb to listen. And as you can see, we listen with our eyes. We listen when we're looking at something, we're actually listening and absorbing it. We listen with our focus by giving something our undivided attention. We listen with our hearts, our emotions. Actually, believe it or not, affect the way that we process and hear something, hear a conversation. For example, let me just give an example. Like if you're upset and someone could be saying something and you interpret it a completely different way because you are completely upset, so you're really focused on, maybe getting your point across or yourself being heard, or you're focused on being angry, and so our emotions really affect the way that we absorb a conversation. Also, we listen with our minds, so cognitive development, our cognition really affects the way that we hear, process, and perceive a message. And then we also, most basically, we listen with our ears and we hear. Have you ever thought of listening as really decoding a message? There's really I bet you never thought of like listening to words or a conversation as decoding a message, and that's exactly what it is. You are decoding a message from the sender, and based on your response, it's like, did you get the correct message? Was there noise involved? There's noise involved that really messes up, interferes with the point that we're actually trying to get across. And I want you to begin, as we go through this lecture, I want you to begin to think about how distracted we are in conversations, how much the other person might not know it, but how much you just zone out in conversations. Like, you're probably zoned out while I'm talking right now, but I just noticed that, like, especially like with cell phones and email and social media, and just life is so crazy, we tend to zone out, especially, with our kids or with, our colleagues at work. We do tend to zone out. It says Microsoft study showed that our attention span is like, it was 12 seconds, now it's down to 7, and probably with more recently it's probably cut in half. So let's look at the process of listening and what takes place when we actually receive a message. So here is the 5-stage model to listening. When we listen, we receive the message, we attempt to decode it and understand it, we evaluate it, and then we respond. Now, lapses can occur at each of these stages. For example, at the receiving stage, you could only receive part of the message. Like when someone's talking to you and the phone rings and you're distracted and you're like, huh, what'd you say? So you only get part of the message. And that could be because of noise, and we call noise just basically anything that interferes with the messages, so that makes us fail to receive any part of the message. And similarly, at a stage of understanding, you could understand part of the message, but because of everybody's inability to share another person's meaning, exact meaning, specific meaning, we could fail to understand other parts of the messages. And the same issue goes for remembering, evaluating, and responding. And so this model draws basically on a variety of previous models of listening that researchers have developed over the years. So if you've ever been in a conversation and someone is like, are you listening to me? And you're like, yes, I'm listening to you. But like, they're like, but do you hear me? Right? So listening and hearing are not the same thing. So hearing is the process in which sound waves really strike your eardrums. They cause these vibrations and then they're transmitted to our brains. Listening, on the other hand, it occurs when our brains reconstruct electrochemicals, and they turn it into this representation of the original sound, and then they give that sound meaning. So that's the difference between hearing and listening. Now, when our brain does this, there are two types of listening. There's active listening and there's passive listening. But listen, our brains, no pun intended, our brains are given so much stimuli, so we can't, it's impossible to listen mindfully to 100% of the things that we hear 100% of the time. So what most of us do is that we fall back on our long-held beliefs. We fall back on stereotypes, we fall back on cliches, and this kind of helps our brain to make sense of the messages that we're receiving. Make sense? The truth is, we all listen differently. Let's take a quick look at some obstacles or even some bad habits that we have when we attempt to listen, and if we address them, they can help us listen more carefully. So first are distractions, physical distractions like music, your neighbor's playing music really loud, or your roommate's talking really loud, or they can be mental distractions. Like your concern is on something other than what you're trying to focus on. They can be biased or prejudiced. If you see someone, and you say, oh, I'm not going to listen to her, she's young, what does she know? It could be prejudice based on age, it could be prejudice based on race, it could be prejudice based on, they look like somebody that you dated, and you just have like an internal bias against them. We all hold different biases and prejudices, so that can inhibit our ability to receive information from someone, take direction, and it can definitely inhibit our ability to listen. Also, lack of focus. We can, again, we have so much stimuli going on. It's coming at us in all directions: television, our cell phones, children, work, school, caring for an elderly parent. And so our focus can be all over the place, and that can inhibit our ability to listen. And then we also have premature judgment, which kind of ties in with bias and prejudices. When you kind of feel like, oh, I already know what they're going to say, so you put your mind on autopilot and you really don't listen to what someone is going to say. Additional barriers to listen include actual physiological barriers. Let's say somebody is diagnosed, physiological barriers, somebody is diagnosed with ADHD, their brains are going to be an impediment to them focusing and actually listening, a genuine impediment. Also sidebar conversations, when people are like whispering behind your back, you're kind of like, oh my gosh, are they talking about me? What are y'all saying behind my back? So that's going to be a barrier to listening. Your cell phone, research indicates that when you're in class, for example, and your cell phone vibrates, it takes you about 23 minutes to refocus fully on the lecture or the topic in the classroom. 23 minutes. So let's say after 30 minutes it buzzes again, you're done for class, you're not going to be able to focus. So cell phones can be a huge distraction. Also, if you're asleep, I am not a morning person, and if you are sleepy, and you're not getting enough sleep, new parents can attest to this. Your focus is going to inhibit the way that you give and receive information and how you listen. Let's see. If you find somebody unattractive, this is one of the forms of power that we'll go over later in the class. I think it's under when we talk about conflict resolution. If you find somebody unattractive, you're less likely to listen to them. We call this, I think it's a referent power, which says that we are more likely to listen to somebody that we find attractive or that we admire some kind of quality about them. In some way, they have more influence. So less attractive people, they have less influence, and therefore they're less likely that you're going to want to listen to them. It's just, a fact of the research. I didn't write it. It's just a research fact. So yeah, those are barriers to listening. So if you find yourself in the middle of a conversation and you find yourself consistently drifting off, you want to take a step back, and not during the conversation, but maybe afterwards, and say, like, let's say, for example, your child tries to talk to you and you consistently find yourself drifting off. You want to take a step back and say, what was preventing me from really being an active listener in that conversation? Was it, distraction? Was my focus off? Was I sleepy? Was I tired? Was I stressed? Etc., etc. So just going back and re-examining conversations where we didn't do such a great job of listening could actually be really beneficial. So some steps to actually show that you are an active listener are: number one, show that you're paying attention. Maybe show through your nonverbal communication. Lean in, nod your head, smile, give some kind of nonverbal feedback to really reassure the listener that you understand and you're listening to what they're saying. Show that you're listening. Provide verbal feedback, and this can be done through perception checking or just repeating what you think that they said, like, oh, so what you meant was X, Y, and Z, just to clarify, asking clarifying questions. Also, a great way to be an active listener is to avoid, refrain from judging, like, oh, I already know what they're gonna say, I don't want to hear it, it's just being having premature thoughts about what the person is going to say. So reserve your judgment, sit, hear a person out, especially if there's conflict involved, and also responding appropriately. If I'm talking and, about, going on a soliloquy about, oh, yeah, I've just been so stressed out lately and, I'm just pouring my heart out, and then you're like, you want to go get some Krispy Kreme donuts or something totally off topic. It's just like, man, so you really want to respond appropriately, and really that requires tapping into empathy. Empathy means that I have to find something in what you're saying, and it must be reflected in me. I have to connect with what you're saying. Connect with something in me must connect with something that you're saying. And that's essentially empathy. And empathy is a big part of being a great listener.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
There was a female researcher, and her name is Ellen Langer. And what she did is she began to study active and mindful listening. And this began because her grandmother started complaining about headaches, really, really bad headaches. I don't know if any of you guys have ever cared for an aging parent. Elderly people can say things that can be perceived as like, what, grandma, what are you talking about? Like, what? Like, they can say things that are different when they're describing pain. I cared for my grandfather. I took care of also my grandmother when she had diabetes. So it can be difficult to apply active listening when you're caring for an aging parent and also when you're caring for young children. So the grandmother began to complain about headaches, and the grandmother told Ellen that the headaches were coming from snakes crawling around in her head, right? And so Ellen's like, she didn't understand, so she kind of wrote it off. And so for years she kept thinking about what her grandmother went, because her grandmother kept complaining. So finally she took the grandmother to the doctor, and the doctor kind of just diagnosed her as senile. He just wrote it off as senility, and she deferred to the diagnosis because of the doctor's expertise. Don't we do that sometimes? We just, instead of listening or active listening, we kind of just we resort to stereotypes, cliches, expertise, etc., etc. And so for years Ellen kept thinking about the doctor's reaction to her grandmother's complaints, and they went through the motions of the diagnosis, but they weren't open to what they were hearing from the grandmother. And so premature mindsets often interfere with what we're hearing. And unfortunately, Ellen did not question the doctor, and her grandmother ended up dying of a brain tumor. And this is many of our daily decisions about whether we listen mindfully, they're not this extreme. They don't have life and death consequences, but we can look at this as a cautionary tale that we need to listen consciously and carefully about what others are telling us. And sometimes, especially when it's to do with children or caring for an elderly parent, we have to really read between the lines and really get in there and do some active listening. Just a few references for your review. Okay, before we go, remember that I asked you guys to remember a list of words. And I wonder exactly how many words that you can actively recall now that we're at the end of our lecture. If you remember the word night, that's probably because I repeated it several times on the list. Repetition has been said to be the mother and father of learning. So if you want to recall something, repeating it is a really great idea. Well, I want you to try to remember or say out loud how many words you can remember. Students, when I do this in class face-to-face, the top person only can remember 7 words. How many words did you remember from the list? When working adults were asked to name the most common communication behavior that they observed in their place of business, listening topped the list. And the business world is not the only setting in which listening is vital. When a group of adults were asked to rank various communication skills according to their importance, that tops the family social list, listening topped there as well. And finally, in committed relationships, listening to personal information, especially at the end of the day when you first get home and you just want to share your day with your partner or your kids, in everyday conversations, listening is considered the most important ingredient to satisfaction. Mindful listening involves giving careful attention and responses to the messages that we receive. Remember that listening ranks first in frequency as far as communication activities are concerned, and it is listening that really opens the door to that communication. Remember, if you're not listening, you're not even having a conversation. Well, I hope that you view your conversations in the way that you actually listen and hear the people in your lives, your colleagues, your children, your spouse. I hope that you listen differently and you take an opportunity this week to listen mindfully. Well, I'm Professor Herron. I thank you so much. That's been our lecture on listening. If you have any questions, you know how to get in touch. Thanks for watching.